안녕하세요, 김지윤입니다. 오늘은 슈피겔지의 르네 피스터 기자가 쓴 잘못된 단어라는 책을 소개해드리려고 합니다. 진보 좌파 측에서 규정하는 잘못된 단어 때문에 많은 사람들이 오히려 침묵하고 자유민주주의를 해칠 수도 있다라는 도발적인 내용을 담았는데요. 그럼 르네 피스터 기자를 만나보시죠. Great pleasure to meet you. And can I call you Rene?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is your book in Korean version. I found this very interesting and provocative at the same time. I have to first ask you, what do you mean by the wrong words?
Of course, it is a provocative title, but what I wanted to express is a lot of people had the feeling that they get into trouble when they use a wrong word, a wrong phrase, when they have a worldview, an opinion that offend other people. And I think that is a phenomenon that you can see all over the Western world. So one starting point for my book was that you see polls in the United States, you see polls in Great Britain, and also in Germany, that around about 50% of the population thinks they can't say what they think, especially about hot button issues like, for example, migration. My critics would say, well, that's a good thing. If people keep their opinions to themselves, then you have a more sensitive debate, then you have a more reasonable debate, people don't get offended. And I argue that is the wrong assumption, I would say, because in a democracy, you always have the opportunity to articulate your grievances, your anger, your frustration at the ballot box.
Well, it's basically, I thought the book was criticizing way too dogmatic liberals and the left. What has come is probably the advent of the far right-wing populists such as Donald Trump or the right-wing parties in Europe. And you think the trend in the United States and Great Britain and also in a lot of countries in Europe is prevalent because there's a left and liberal wing, and they are way too dogmatic and obsessed with the political correctness. So people are afraid to say, as you said, what's in their minds. And that is actually going against the liberal side, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's my assumption. The first thought that crossed my mind was, is it really the time to write about the dogmatic left? We were in a situation where Donald Trump was pushed out of office, was not elected again in a free and fair election, and yet he claimed he won this election. So he incited this mob to storm the Capitol. And of course, I asked myself, is it the right time to write a book about the left that's kind of counterintuitive? But I thought that, first of all, I described, the dangers for democracy from Donald Trump very intensively. So we ran a cover story in 2020. But on the other hand, I tried to explain, and that was another goal of my book, why was Donald Trump elected in the first place? And I think that has something to do with the shift in the Democratic Party, but more broadly, I would say the shift in the left movement. Why was Donald Trump elected? I think he was elected because there's this feeling of betrayal in white working class circles. White working class people in the United States always were the backbone of the Democratic Party, and they voted for them. And then in the 19th, the Democratic Party shifted their economic politics. They opened the market for other countries, and that created a lot of growth. But the losers were these working class who lost their jobs because their jobs were shipped to China or were shipped to Mexico. And the great winners were college-educated people at the coast who know how to deal with this knowledge-based society, with this knowledge-based economy. And at the same time, the Democratic Party showed their belonging to the left by changing their language. They talked about structural racism. They talked about gender inequality. They used this opaque academic language. And these working class voters who had already the feeling of betrayal felt on top, looked upon. The party leaders speak a different language and they don't take them seriously. And that was the opening for Donald Trump, because he said, not only did you lose your job, they're laughing at you because you don't speak this academic language. And I think that was a huge explanation for the success of Donald Trump in 2016.
Well, what surprised me is, because you're a journalist from Spiegel. From my understanding, Spiegel is slightly leaning toward left. But your criticism is focusing on the left in the United States mostly. But also, as you said, you are also criticizing Donald Trump for being a right-wing populist, etc. I don't know. So you probably have been hated by both sides, I would say.
It was a controversial book, there's no doubt about it. And you're right when you're saying the Spiegel is a more left-leaning magazine. So our founder, Rudolf Augstein, coined the famous phrase, im Zweifel links. But I mean, I think that is absolutely necessary for us to have big news outlets like the Spiegel, like the Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany, like the New York Times, that we have a wide range of opinions. Not only because it's more interesting, right? Because it's more challenging for our readers, but also because I think in the changing media landscape, we have to structure the debate. Because we see now that we have a very fragmented society and we don't get the genie back in the bottle, but I think it's our chance in this more fragmented society to structure a debate, to show to our readers that there are different opinions on issues, and then that we have to structure this debate and come to a consensus. And I think it's absolutely crucial for us, for news outlets, to have a wide range of opinions. So a lot of colleagues disagreed with my book, of course, but that's totally fine. And so the reviews in Germany were very friendly in general. And I think that shows me that there's really there's a longing, the need for an open debate, and every intelligent person sees that you can't organize a democracy in filter bubbles, in opinion bubbles.
Well, to enjoy your book better, we have to understand some of the jargon, some of the words, such as like microaggression, cancel culture, and the culture appropriation, and of course, woke. So could you please tell us what these are about?
Cancel culture is maybe the most controversial phrase. So I try to avoid the word cancel culture in my book because it's used so extensively and everybody understands something different. My friends on the left would say, well, cancel culture is a phantasma. It doesn't exist. But I think cancel culture is something different. Cancel culture is the attempt not to engage with somebody with arguments, but to create uproar on social media, to create anger on social media, to attack somebody. And, the whole purpose of this thing is to get somebody deplatformed or even fired. And I would say that's cancel culture. What did we have? Microaggressions. That's interesting. It's a concept of a professor who I think he still works at Columbia University with David Ring Sue, and he coined this phrase, microaggression. And behind the phrase microaggression, there's the idea that while open racism is rescinding in the United States, there is a new form of racism that we witness. So behind the thought is that racism is always a part of society. It shows in new forms. And the new form now is a microaggression. So that, for instance, what is in Germany seen as a microaggression is the question, where you're from, means that I think you don't belong to our society. I would agree that might be the case. Sometimes that's the purpose, like where you're from. So in the sense of we don't want to have foreigners in our country. But in most cases, I would say that this question, where you're from, is just, maybe starting a conversation or out of curiosity. And I think in a multicultural society, it's really necessary to ask people where their roots are. I mean, I'm constantly asked when I use, Uber in the United States, because I have obviously a strong German accent, where you're from. And the problem with microaggressions, in my view, is that, when you see an offensive word around every corner, the necessary debate in a multicultural society dies. And I think that is the problem with microaggression. Then cultural appropriation is just the thought that one culture, one race exploits cultural achievement of a different race. So, for example, a white cook is not allowed to write a cookbook about Mexican food. But in general, I would say, the great thing about a multicultural society is that, cultures mix. And, you have the best of every world. And if you think the thought of cultural appropriation consequently to the end, then everybody stays in its corner and you don't have, an atmosphere that creates something new. And I think that's the basic problem with cultural appropriation. And then finally, woke. So woke was a positive term. In the first place, I would say woke was a word that was coined by Black activists, and it meant that you have an open eye for injustices and discrimination in the society, and you will fight them. But I think if you like it or not, the right was very successful in coining or reframing the word woke in the sense that woke people are people who are hypersensitive, who go after people who don't agree with them and who have, in their view, offensive worldviews.
Well, in Korea, a lot of people just use the word like PC, like encompassing what you all said so far, like political correctness. We are so obsessed with the political correctness, and there are some people who are complaining about that.
In all these debate about wokeness, we can't leave behind, a sensitivity and good manners. And if somebody doesn't want to talk about it, that's just fine. As I said, there is a kernel of truth in the question, where are you from, is offensive. But my argument is it's not offensive in every case. And that's what I try to express in my book.
But I would still be offended if there's a Chinese guy running a Korean restaurant and he cannot really cook well. Yeah, so I understood that your book is saying it's not just so-called right-wing populists who is threatening the liberal democracy. It's left and liberals also are threatening the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, such as freedom of speech, freedom of expression, because all these obsessions are actually pressuring people not to say what they think in real. What was really striking was actually the universities, because universities are supposed to be the place for the free debate. You can say whatever you want. It is, well, maybe not whatever you want, but it's relatively welcomed any kind of debate. But you were saying that the students in the college and universities are more likely not allowing any dissent.
So my critics say we do not have a problem with freedom of speech because there is no state censorship. And they are right. You look at the United States, you look at Germany, you look at Great Britain, you look at France. I would say, we don't have problem with censorship in the big Western countries. But my argument in the book is that for an open and a real and honest debate, you have to have two things. First of all, the absence of state censorship. And second of all, a culture of freedom of speech. So the thing that I explained earlier, that the people have the impression that they can freely talk about very controversial issues. And when that's not the case, you have bad consequences. And that brings us to the question, why is it? Why do so many people have the impression that they can't speak openly? And I think that has something to do with the development over the last 40, 50 years on the left, especially on the academic left, and that seeped into society. So in my explanation is that, in the 60s in the United States, you had this huge successes of the civil rights movement. Yeah, the Jim Crow era ended with the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. He signed the Civil Rights Act, and that was, the result of the liberal democracy, of struggle in society, and that was a great thing. And the hope was that with this legislation, the disparities in the society would disappear, that Black people would get richer, the incarceration rates would go down, and these hopes were disappointed. It doesn't materialize, at least in a way that a lot of people hoped for. And that brought a lot of people, especially in academia, to the conclusion that liberal principles, the liberal state, is not part of the solution, but a part of the problem. That, for example, freedom of speech is just a tool for the powerful to oppress the marginalized. And so all kinds of theory and concepts were developed to dismantle the liberal state or cut back the liberal state to abolish these disparities. And I think these concepts, we can talk about them, a way to threaten the liberal state, liberal principles. And that has bad consequences, I think. And another example is that, the definition of what is racism was widely extended. I think a reasonable definition of racism is that one race think it's superior to another. Whites think they're superior to Black. But in the United States, we had a new definition of racism, that every disparity in society is a consequence of racism. And if you disagree, you're a racist itself. And that created created, I think, with a lot of people, the feeling that you can't, debate openly real problems in society.
So you have to be in the same side, like fighting for the climate change and fighting for the racism and feminism and everything. Otherwise, you're, I don't know, kind of similar things happening in Korea as well, but you are considered to be very outdated and conservative and deplorable, maybe, like Hillary Clinton said.
The word deplorable was the classic example for Democrats looking down on working class voters, because that was the phrase that Hillary Clinton used for the Donald Trump voters. Interesting thing was that the Trump voters adopted this phrase. They said, well, yes, we are the deplorables. We are grateful for this new identity that Hillary Clinton gave us. And I think that is really super dangerous when you look down on your voters and they say, well, okay, you look down on us and we will vote for the other guy.
Well, what was impressive part, the phrase in the book, I thought, was that what Joe McCarthy did in 1950s exactly repeated by the liberals right now.
I'm a little bit hesitant if we see a repetition of the McCarthy area. I think there are similarities, I would say, to push people out of their jobs.
What do you think is the reason for this? I mean, it was not like that. I remember like 10 or 15 years ago, I had friends who are Democrats and also Republicans, but they can cross the aisles and talk to each other and laugh at each other. But it's not happening now. They don't talk to each other. They always fight. And so what is the reason? There should be some momentums like that actually polarize the people. And since then, people do not really talk to each other or something like that. But so in America, in the United States, I was wondering what could be that point, what could be that moment.
You're totally right. I mean, the polarization in the society of the United States is really, really bad. And it's really interesting when you talk to people on the left and on the right, everybody is unhappy with it. I made a story in 2020. I went to a small town in Pennsylvania and talked to a lot of Republicans. And they said, well, couple of years ago, we had Democratic friends. We went out to a bar. We had differences and we didn't agree on everything, but we were able to have a beer together. That really is no longer the case, that people are in their filter bubbles and they are not able to have a serious conversation. And that is really a bad thing. And when you ask me, why is it? I would say there are different explanations. For example, I would say social media is a big factor. Everybody, is now on social media, gets fired up very easily because of these algorithms that, only feed your narrative, your worldview. That is one explanation. And I think, the MAGA movement is really another part of the explanation. They frame the Democrats not as, people who hold different worldviews, but the enemy. And then also that you don't have that much independence anymore. So there is this concept of political scientists in the United States of calcification, that, you have a big chunk of Democratic voters, a big chunk of Republican voters, and, the independents in between, they are like a dying species because the numbers go down. And that is also a problem because, these people in the middle, they are the kind of glue that holds the society together. That would be my explanations for the polarization in the United States.
But somehow feel like the liberal side is also responsible for that. I don't know, that's probably why I found your book is pretty interesting, because you're pointing out all those problems that liberal and left have right now in America and Great Britain. You also mentioned some in Germany as well. I actually read the article before the book was out. The title was Brahman Left versus Merchant Right. In the 1960s, those very hardworking workers in the factories, they were breadwinners and they really cared about their children and took care of their education. So they were, of course, the Democrats. But 30 years or 40 years later, their kids who got good education with his father's and mother's effort, now they are earning a lot of money. They still maintain the stance of the Democrats, but what they are interested are different. It's not about the labor, it's not about the factory workers, but it is about other issues such as climate change same-sex marriage, abortion, which are not directly related to those who are working every single day in the conveyor belt.
I would say it's the fate of a lot of left parties that they are a victim of their own success, I would say, and that's really the problem. So, for example, the Social Democratic Party in Germany was always, traditionally the party of the working class in Germany, and a lot of people with a working class background got a college degree and they started to think about different things. And I think the problem for a lot of left-wing parties is that they lost the ability to speak to working class people. In Germany, a lot of former voters of the Social Democratic Party now are voters of the Alternative for Deutschland. And you see this phenomenon in the United States that not necessarily Joe Biden, I would say, but a lot of people in the Democratic Party, they are now the party for the college-educated elites and not the party of the working class anymore. And that is a real problem. So when you analyze the political situation in the United States, the base of the Republican Party are now white working class voters, but increasingly Latino voters are voting for Donald Trump too. So the Democrats already thought that with a more diverse America, eventually they will win every election, because the assumption was that black voters and Latino voters are, the natural base for the Democratic Party. And now it turns out that Donald Trump managed to attract especially black male voters. The majority is still voting for the Democrats, but given the slim margins in the American elections, this is really a threat for the Democrats when a lot of Latino voters and a lot of black men are voting for the Republicans.
Well, I think it's getting way too late for us. I have to let my staff go. So
It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much, Renee, for the interview and for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a nice day.
You too. Thank you so much.